Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Godikson, and I am the Director of Customer Solutions here at Socket Labs. And I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about StreamScore. And specifically, I wanted to dive in and do a case study analysis of a recent customer issue that cropped up. And one of the nice things in my role with helping customers optimize their implementation with Socket Labs is that I get to kind of help them when really complex situations pop up. And recently we had a customer that started to become under attack from a malicious actor that was sending some fish. So let's talk about that attack and let's talk about how we use StreamScore to really kind of help us solve a lot of the complex decision making that we needed to do of answering questions from the business and our customer about, hey, is this a priority to fix? And how is this impacting our mail? Um, so the attack, let's get into it. So our customer is a B2B SaaS platform that focuses on kind of management and hosting of events. And so what the attack entailed was a malicious actor coming to their website and signing up for an account. And when they'd sign up for an account, they'd start a new event and they'd create a landing page for that event to accept registrations. And what they did was kind of interesting. They would create this landing page and they just put a single form field on that landing page. No other content, just a form field for an email address. And then what they did, which was genius, was they customized the event confirmation message. So when you would register for the event, you get a confirmation message and our customer generates and sends a message to confirm this. And the attacker was customizing the confirmation message to appear as if it was a receipt from an antivirus company. And there was a call to action to call to cancel this order. And it was a really interesting attack because it wasn't something our customers kind of really expecting or prepared for in their service, and nothing they'd really encountered before. So let's take a look at just like the numbers from a big picture. This is a 30-day view into kind of what our portal looked like for our customer. And you can see in this 30-day window, they sent about 1 million messages. And I went through and I calculated that about 75,000 of those messages were fish. So not a decent, a pretty decent amount. And most of the attack, the window was about 17 days. And during that period, you can kind of see this in the data. Our customer is kind of playing whack-a-mole of, hey, a new malicious account would pop up and they'd shut it down. And then a few days later, the attacker would come back and set up 1 or 2 new accounts and we'd shut them down. And this kind of continued over the 17 days. And some really interesting things started to appear in StreamScore. And for those who are unfamiliar with StreamScore, it's pretty simple. It's a 0 to 100 number, and it tells you how we think your email's performing. And with that 0 to 100 number, we also give you 3 what we call sub-scores or categorical scores. And those are about the audience, so who you're sending to. Things like, are you sending to a lot of role accounts? Or are you sending to a lot of spam traps, a lot of invalid addresses? Then we look at how recipients are reacting to messages. Are people happy to get this mail, or are they reacting in some kind of negative way? And then we'll look at aggregate data directly from mailbox providers, and in kind of the data of where mailbox providers and anti-spam systems kind of tell us how they're doing, whether that's directly or indirectly. So ultimately, across these 3 categories, we have about 35 different data points. And I kind of wanted to dive into each one of these a little bit more in detail and pull out some really interesting metrics within each of them and kind of use that to tell the story of what was really happening during this incident where our customer was generating and sending phishing messages from their platform. So first, let's just look at StreamScore as a whole. And at the aggregate level, our customers normally scoring somewhere in the mid to low 80s. And during the peak of the attack, their StreamScore dropped all the way down into the low, mid to high 50s, I'd say. And so that was around the peak of the attack when around day 17, when we had the largest range of data in the scoring for all of the malicious messages. And this doesn't look really, I looked at this graph and I'm like, yeah, it tells the story of the score dropping a lot. But when I looked at this customer stream score over an even greater period of time, I think it's a little bit more telling of just how dramatic this drop was and really how anomalous this was to their normal performance rates. And that's a pretty big dip there. So what about the individual metrics? How did those each perform? And it's kind of fun to put them all on top of each other because we see a few different things happening here. And we'll get into each one in a little bit more detail. But first, just you can see immediately the audience score doesn't really change that much. And there's some reasons for that. The real change that we see is what we saw with the engagement. So how users were reacting to receiving messages. And we saw some really strong indications, as you would expect with phishing messages, of people reacting negatively. And we saw some interesting data in reputation and a few things to note just at this really high level. First, it took the reputation score an extra few days to kind of start to see a real impact here. And it never really dropped that much. And I got some really interesting data points again that we'll get into here in a second that tell that story of why it took a few days to see a reaction in that category and why it never really dropped that low. So first, let's talk about the audience score. And what we can see here is that over, I picked, I think, a larger window here, maybe a 45-day window. We can see that the delivery rates dropped during the period of the attack, but not that substantially ultimately. Somewhat surprisingly even. The interesting thing is the attackers kind of have the same motives as the sender or the marketer, or in this case, the B2B platform. They want messages to reach real users. So while the attacker has a much more sloppier data management process, meaning it looks like they're maybe not parsing bounces and things like that when they're generating and sending messages through like a third-party system, their address or the addresses they were targeting for the most part were real users. They generally tended to be consumers. So they weren't doing things like sending to a whole lot of spam traps. They weren't sending to a whole lot of role accounts. They weren't sending to a lot of disposable addresses. And this meant that while we saw an increase in bounces, because our customer generally sends pretty good mail as a transactional stream of messages, it wasn't that dramatic. And that's why, again, when you look at specifically at this audience score, we see, it dropped down to the low 80s, where it's normally closer to almost 100 consistently. So again, not a huge change with the audience. So let's look at the engagement data. And when we talk engagement, most people in email immediately think opens, clicks, and unsubscribes. But in this case, our customer doesn't actually record this data. I shouldn't say they don't do it at all. For some messages, they do record opens and clicks. But for the most part, they don't capture open and click data on this stream of email messages. It's transactional. And so this leads to a really interesting thing. We have to do a performance score, and we don't have what many would be considering the core metrics of engagement. But we built StreamScore in a really adaptive way, and it can handle cases when we don't have data points like opens and clicks. And so we focused specifically in this case is in looking at complaints in terms of understanding how people are reacting to messages. And we don't look at just the overall complaint rate, although that is one of the 35 data points. We can see that here. That's actually our blue line going across the screen. But we also record and calculate provider-specific complaint rates. And as you can see, I graphed two of them here. I graphed Yahoo and Hotmail because they're the largest vendors that support sending feedback loops. We can see much more dramatic increases. And when the changes are that drastic or that anomalous, it really helps in the scoring algorithms to detect something's wrong. And this is where StreamScore can be really powerful as say, a sender, you might see an increase in complaints. In this case, our customer went from usually around 0.03% to somewhere over 0.2, so a 7 times increase. But if we look at what happened with, say, a Yahoo specific complaint rate, it went up at a much higher rate. So it really changed much more dramatically. And this is what we're able to key in on with StreamScore and really drive, what we saw with the engagement score, which was plummeting, a plummet down to almost zero, because the complaints were at such high rates. This wasn't something that was probably sustainable, so we scored this at, well, darn near zero here at times during the height of the attack. So let's dive into and talk about reputation a little bit. And when you think reputation, the first thing I think of are things like Google Postmaster tools and Microsoft SNDS. And something really funny happened here. We saw basically no strong indicators in these reputation tools that there was a major problem. Google Postmaster tools said our customer's reputation was still high. And to me, this is kind of befuddling, right? We see this huge negative reaction. Messages are being marked as spam at a really high rate, yet the reputation stayed high. And so why is that? Well, I think there's a few reasons this happened. I think one, the transactional mail stream, they're still being processed, right? So while there were 75,000 phish messages being sent over this attack period, there was also close to 1 million legitimate messages. And that sends really kind of conflicting signals. And they're hard to kind of enumerate in a 4-tier categorical score like Postmaster tools, where you only get medium, high, low, and bad. And in SNDS, we didn't see much either. I will note the complaint rates you can kind of see go up during the periods of the attack, and we see some volume changes, which are abnormal in some of these cases, but it really, we didn't see any change to the colors. And ultimately, a lot of the largest consumer mailbox providers, we didn't see a huge change in deliverability, or what we would consider deliverability rates. We don't actually know a number here, but the legitimate messages didn't really see huge spam folder placement issues at the major mailbox providers. So what other data points can we look at and do an analysis of in the reputation category? Well, there's a lot of data that we can infer from mailbox providers that tell us the story about reputation, even if they're not given to us in a direct portal, like with Postmaster tools and Microsoft's SNDS. So what I pulled out of our data set, which I thought was just super cool how this all comes together and lines up, is I pulled out the rate that we call SMTP block response. And so these are messages that when we send them, we get an error back from the receiving system indicating that the message was blocked from delivery because the message looked like spam or the sender reputation was too low, that kind of like block response. And then we also, as a part of StreamScore, we run what I would kind of describe as like a poor man seed list test. And we send random messages that process through our customer's account to mailbox providers and do an analysis of, well, how much of that mail is reaching the inbox. And we kind of it's kind of like a seed list test, but in a more sporadic and less kind of campaign type configuration. And so I have those two things graphed here. The red line is our block rate. The yellow line is our spam rate. And I threw in it's not included in reputation, but I threw into this chart also the complaint rate from one of our last graphs. We see something really interesting here, that complaints started to go up around June 1st. And as complaints started to go up, 24 to 48 hours later, we start to see a slight increase in the block response rate and in the seed test messages getting filtered to the junk folder. And that pattern kind of continued as complaints went up. So did the block response rate and the filtering rate. And that actually continued, and there was this delay. So there was like this 48-hour delay in the response from some mailbox providers. And that's part of why it took a few days for the reputation score to kind of catch up. First off, we had really positive signals from the direct data providers like Postmaster Tools and SNDS, but other metrics within the reputation category of StreamScore, we saw really negative responses. So we saw the change or the impact from the spam processing. And then what I love about this data too is you can see how it's a lagging indicator, that it takes the negative reaction from recipients to be kind of aggregated by the mailbox providers, where then the next day we start to see the impacts to filtering. And then what also I think is really interesting is once our customer kind of fixed the issue and they started seeing a decrease in their complaint rates, it took a much longer period of time for the filtering and SMTP block responses to kind of fall off, meaning the mailbox providers kind of had to learn that the messages that our customer was sending were no longer malicious or phishing, and that had been eliminated. Now, I give them credit. We actually saw basically a full restoration of deliverability once our customer took action. But we saw the delay in the response from the mailbox providers, and then a delay, even larger delay in the response to it being fixed. And so all of that data came together to tell the story of our reputation score. And again, we had really mixed points. We had Google telling us everything's fine and dandy, everything's a high reputation. We, at the same time, saw these increases in blocks and filtering at some of the other mailbox providers. So our reputation score kind of tells the story here, where there was a slight decrease, where the reputation score kind of went down to around the 80s, and then kind of came back up. And, over time, as they kind of solved some of the issues, we saw a restoration of, the data. We saw a restoration of deliverability ultimately. So all of this being summarized in StreamScore in this, the three category scores and the 0 to 100 number, they really help solve the issue, because our customers coming to us, and we were meeting with them, and they were asking all these questions like, is this impacting all of our mail? Like, are we going to be playing whack-a-mole forever? Do we need to prioritize a fix to get this addressed? And in basically every question, I was able to kind of turn back to them and say, well, what we're seeing in the StreamScore data tells us that, you do have a problem. It is impacting all of your mail. You should then prioritize a fix. What was great was our customer was able to take StreamScore, use that as one of the decision-making KPIs to go to their leadership team and get a change in prioritization of engineering work to be able to build some restrictions into the product to help them kind of address some of the kind of gaps that this bad actor was taking advantage of. So it was really pretty cool. I mean, StreamScore became the best KPI to understand how their mail was impacted by all of these malicious messages. So I do have good news to report, is that going back and prioritizing some engineering work to address the issue was able to, I don't want to say solve the problem. I would like to say it's been a deterrent for this period of time to the malicious actor, and has hopefully moved them on to another platform or another means of abuse, unfortunately. But in reality, our customer is able to stop the impact and improve and restore deliverability. Their StreamScore is back up in the mid to high 80s. We've seen a full, basically, restoration of their reputation, the engagement, how users are reacting, as well as the people that they're contacting. So I hope everyone enjoyed kind of that deep dive. If you want to learn more about StreamScore, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm glad to talk to anyone about all the things we're doing here, because I love the data and nerding out about email. And you can give it a try. We have a free demo accounts and would love to get some feedback on it. So let us know how we could make StreamScore become your ultimate decision-making KPI.